Yeah, so I'm Kathy Schoonover Schaffner. God's called me currently to be the National Director of Nurses Christian Fellowship, and I've been the editor of the Journal of Christian Nursing since 2004, but now I'm the editor-in-chief. And there's some contact information for us. Jennifer, we publish a lot on faith community nursing in our journal. So yeah.
I found a lot of your stuff to be helpful.
Yeah.
And that's actually how I found this conference, was following a link, and there I was. So.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'm Kathy. And I'm today, my goal is to introduce you to the theory of ambiguous loss by Pauline Boss, and then share some insights with you and how you can be aware and consider those that are experiencing ambiguous loss. So why is loss ambiguous? Well, ambiguous is when something's open to more than one meaning or interpretation. And it can be an unclear or inexact situation because a choice between alternatives has not been made. And so you put that unclearness and ambiguity with loss of being deprived of or being without someone or something that you've had, and you get ambiguous loss. So Pauline Boss worked with, she's a psychologist at the University of Minnesota. She's retired now, but she worked with wives of prisoners of war during the Vietnam War. And she, in her work, she came up with this idea that people have lost someone, but they're still there. And so she defines it as the incomplete, uncertain, and devastating loss experienced by those in close relationship with someone who goes missing. And the ambiguous loss is more devastating than a permanent loss, such as a death, because it's indeterminate. You have grief and confusion because there's so many unknowns and there's lack of closure. When a loved one is physically absent, but psychologically present, like with the POWs, or when someone is, been taken captive, or physically present, but psychologically absent. And so she talks about being not here, but here, as in war, natural disasters, a kidnapping, a desertion, some kind of mysterious disappearance. So we don't know what happened to the person. And then more common situations is military deployment. When husband goes away or wife goes away for 6 months or a year. So they're not here, but they're still with me psychologically. In adoption situations, in divorce and remarriage, work relocation, leaving home, or like an elderly mate. So they're gone, but they're still with you. And then here, but not here, is what happened to me. It's sort of a catastrophic or unexpected situation like Alzheimer's and other dementias, traumatic brain injury, which is what happened to my husband, a stroke, or just someone being unconscious, chronic or acute mental illness. If someone gets really heavy into drugs and alcohol addictions, acute depression. She talks about more common situations like immigration, being homesick, divorce, remarriage, again, foster adoption, foster care, preoccupation with work, and obsession with computer games on the internet. So the question is the problem is, the more the ambiguity surrounding the loss, the more difficult it is to master it, and the greater your depression or anxiety. So like in my situation where my husband suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, it was very catastrophic and very severe, and was very difficult. And so you're asking yourself, what's our relationship now? What are our roles now? What's going on? And the problem is, it just goes on. And like Alzheimer's is unending. People will just continue to get worse. And there's these endless days before death occurs. So it's very hard to figure out, what are you doing in this situation? So again, the greater the ambiguity surrounding the loss, the more difficult it is to master it, and the greater your depression, anxiety, or your family conflicts. So I'm just going to briefly tell you my story. This was like 6 weeks before my husband was hurt. wait, see, now you can't move them and then they move like crazy, your slides. So this was at a wedding that we had gone to of a dear friend, and it was a great time. And so this is how we were. My husband is an internal medicine physician, had a huge medical practice, very godly man, very kind, very gracious, not a typical old time physician that, I'm the doctor, but just people loved working with him. His patients adored him. And so he was just this great guy. And in October of 2018, 3 years ago, he had climbed on the roof like he does every year to sweep these locust tree pods off. And he fell and hit the concrete and hit his head. And he ended up with what was medically called a severe traumatic brain injury with diffuse axonal injury. So he pretty much smushed his brain, and we didn't think he would live. He was in the ICU for a month, couldn't control his temperature. You see the cooling blanket, they're just intracranial pressure up and down. It was just a mess. And at first we thought he would die. And I thought, I'm gonna have to make the decision about turning off the equipment and letting him go. And my children just begged the Lord for his recovery. And so about a month later, he started physically coming back. He had this huge retrobulbar hematoma in his left eye. You can see the raccoon eyes there. He's still pretty comatose here, but he was able to sit up. And then we went to a rehab, long-term acute care rehab facility. And, I can see the difference in his eyes to this day, just the lack of knowing, the lack of his sense of being lost. This was after he'd been in rehab about a month, and my kids came up. It was near Thanksgiving, and he's in speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. We're kind of slowly crawling back, but he's just not himself. This was at Christmas. I got to bring him home for a few days. And I told him he was my Christmas present. And so I put a bow on him. Again, no recollection. This is like 3 months after the accident. This was my daughter's graduation, and he's starting to have more emotional responses. And so she had finished and is now a school teacher, and he's looking pretty normal there. This was his birthday a few months ago. That's actually a cake. My daughter had this cake made. His favorite foods are bananas and pancakes. Wow. And so she did this cake. So you say, well, how is he different? He has pretty severe expressive aphasia, so he can't find his words and get them out. He has very poor short-term memory, poor cognition. Emotionally, he just really struggles regulating things, finding things. He is able to drive to short locations, but he can't use his cell phone very well. He can't use a computer. He has a horrible time putting gas in his car because he can't figure out how to use the machines and credit and zip code and pass. It just kills him. And very frustrating. So you go from this brilliant man who was just amazing, very healthy, to he's now classified as mentally disabled, and I'm his guardian and conservator. And so what is the problem with this ambiguous loss? Well, you sort of get frozen in the grief process, and it defies resolution because there's no closure. And I thought many times it would have been easier if he had died. And, just understand, he is here, but he is not here, nothing like we were before. We're facing this lack of closure, this unresolved grief. And so in ambiguous loss, you have to live with this irresolvable and perfect situation. What are our roles? I had to figure out, what does it mean to be the head of the house now? And spiritually, that was very hard for me because I'd studied a lot of scripture about marriage and, just figuring out how to move on. And so I had to sort of reconstruct this sense of helplessness and hopelessness to keep moving forward. So what is the goal in those who have experienced ambiguous loss, like mine, or in other situations where someone's missing? So psychologically, you have to understand we love them, we're involved in their lives, but they're not here So when the situation can't be fixed or an illness can't be cured, the therapeutic goal is to help clients live with the inherent stress and anxiety by increasing resilience. Um, we can't get rid of the ambiguity, but we can increase our tolerance of ambiguity. This was in her second book. She published her first book in 1999 and this in 2006. And I cannot find any other books that have been published. It's becoming more well-known now. With COVID-19, people had a lot of ambiguous losses. So they have a job, but they don't have a job, or we have a church, but we can't go to the church. And so, again, the severity of the loss kind of dictates how difficult it is for the person. So he's this caring physician that's lost. And I have to hold these two opposing ideas in my head of the man I knew and the man I married. And he had a good income, and we shared the responsibility of family and figured out leadership decisions together to now I do it by myself. And that was very hard for me. I hold these opposing ideas of the man I love and yet the man that's gone. Very difficult. So what are our goals in ambiguous loss? Well, we're trying to find meaning in it. And Boss did not write from a Christian biblical perspective, but she does include spirituality. And she talks about you have to make some kind of meaning. You have to learn how to temper mastery. Like Renee knows me, and we work together some in Nurses Christian Fellowship and know each other through university. And I love being in control, and I can't control anything now. So I've learned that I don't have to control it. I've had to reconstruct identity, and my husband has as well. Who is he? Who am I? I've learned to just live with this ambivalence. You want to resolve it. You want to be like, come back to me. And you want it to all be normal, and you can't. And I've had to figure out different attachments with my husband now. Going backwards here. So like he can no longer be intimate, and he is very, he's kind of funny. Like he doesn't have any filters. And so he'll look at me and say things like, are you getting fatter? And it's funny because you learn to laugh about these things, but it's like he says the most inappropriate things and to me, and he lets all his filters down with me, which he's more guarded in public. And so trying to revise that husband-wife relationship, because he is not able to love me, scripture says, love your wives as Jesus loved the church. And he's very aware of that. And he'll say things to me like, I ruined everything. And I tell him, no, God has a plan and we're going to be okay. And I try to listen to his agony, but also not let him give into that with me. And then discovering hope. What is God wanting to do in this for me? And other people discover hope, making meaning out of the loss. So you're trying to find meaning and make sense of an event or situation. And as you know, I've been so impressed with what I heard in the speakers, the relationships, the active listening, the collective meaning that we can develop through relationships and interaction. And you have to learn to have both. And so I grieve what's irretrievably lost, but I celebrate what's still present. For my kids, it was like, what happened? We don't have our father the way we had him before, but we still have our father. So what's present with daddy? And he, when he can figure it out, a lot of times he will text them, and he texts them messages that are all garbled, but they love that because it means dad's still here. And so it's really important for us to pursue things that matter deeply to us. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So as I was going through this, I really wrestled with the sovereignty of God. Like my husband was a good man, a good physician. He did a lot of indigent care. we were very involved in that with our church. He taught Sunday school. He and I did it together. And then I played the piano. And so I was doing worship. And, you think, why? Why? And I really struggled with the sovereignty of God. And but some things that really were helpful to me is just realizing that we live in a fallen world and we can't control it. And suffering exists because sin exists. But taking the long view, glimpsing, this is from D.A. Carson's book, How Long, O Lord? He talks about glimpsing at least a little bit of the broad movements of God in redemptive history. And for me, realizing, it's been 3 years and I've thought about, Abraham wandering and where was the promised land? Where was the promised son? But he waited and he decided to accept God's sovereignty. I thought about Joseph, all those years, and then it was about redeeming the people of God and saving them in the famine. I thought about, I've read these stories. I love the story of Ruth and Naomi. And, we read the book of Ruth in 10 minutes. But if you really think about it, they suffered for so long. The sons die, her husband dies, the sons die. She's a widow. She comes back to Bethlehem because finally there's food. And she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, call me bitter, because she doesn't see that God has a plan. And then God did have a plan. And so realizing there's a long view and that God is redeeming the world and that he can supernaturally use suffering. It was really helpful to me to Bible studies, just been a lifeline for me. It was really helpful to me to think about like John the Baptist in Luke 7, where he goes to Jesus, or he's in prison and he lost my place on my notes. Let me go back here. Okay, so he's in prison and he's wondering what's going on. And he asks his disciples to go ask Jesus, are you the one? And you think about that, after all his life, he baptized Jesus. They were cousins. Of course he knew he was the Messiah. Of course he knew. But now he's sort of in prison and wondering about what's going to happen to himself, and he's suffering and he ends up getting beheaded, right? And he asks, are you the one? And that's kind of such a preposterous situation because, I thought, why did he say that? And I think you get into these moments of horrible despair and you're begging God what's going on. And Jesus, this is in different translations, but he says, blessed are those who don't fall away, no matter what happens to them. Blessed are those that hang in there and stick with it, stick with me. And he, after they asked him, are you the one we've been expecting? Or are we still waiting and wondering, is this the kingdom come? The next few hours, he heals many from their diseases and distress and evil spirits. He gives the gift of sight to the blind. And he said, go back and tell John what you've just seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the wretched of the earth have God's salvation and hospitality extended to them. Is this what you are expecting? Then count yourselves fortunate. And he just said, don't fall away. Just wait. The kingdom is here. So that was very helpful to me in my journey of just trying to make sense of this. But I think, and I love the speakers this morning that kept talking about the invisibleness of disability, the invisible issues, and ambiguous loss for me is an invisible disability. And I'm not trying to belittle or change or any other, I'm not, but it's like, no one sees it, no one knows it, no one rarely understands it. But it's this hole in life. And my husband, when you first meet him, he looks for the most part normal, but then, because physically he recovered well, but if you talk to him for long, then he can't get his words out. And, his disability is very much there. And so I'm glad that they have talked about that, people need to be aware that there's the disability. So what can be helpful in ambiguous loss? I acknowledged the loss. It was so funny to me at first when he was so sick and we didn't know if he was going to live. And then he came back over the first year. Nobody wanted to talk about it. It was like, I think people thought if they acted like Richard was normal and I was normal, then that would make me feel better. But I wanted so much to talk to people and talk about what we've been through and try to help them understand. I lost my husband, my whole life changed, my roles changed, my world changed. And now it's like people have kind of totally forgotten. And it isn't like you need to talk about it all the time, but people that we're close with, like our city group, which is our church small group, or people who've known us, like, you need to acknowledge this with us and tolerate this ambiguity with us and include the one who's lost, and include us who are experiencing loss. When we got back, my husband so much wanted to do something. He had been a man who raised on a farm, worked sun up, sundown, after dark. He worked like 15, 14-hour days at the office and, caring for the sick. And he always was working, and now he can't do anything. And so he wanted to go back to helping in Sunday school. He realized he couldn't teach Sunday school, but he just wanted to be a part of it. And they wouldn't let him. The church would not let him. People had changed. It was a different situation, and they wouldn't let him. And I asked to go back on the worship team, and they never called me. And so the isolation was intolerable for us. And I had to really push to figure out, come on, people, he's still here. And I had to push to get myself included. And that was very much a struggle. And so people who have experienced loss so desperately need community. Don't normalize the loss. And some of these are from Pauline Boss and some of these are from me. But when my husband struggles talking, people will say to him, he and I, I forget things all the time here. That's just, you lose your mind as you get old and blah, blah, blah. And I thought that's not his situation, like, be patient with him and, wait on him, let him speak, but also like, don't try to fix it, or don't, it's not the same as what you're going through. Yeah, we all forget things, but this is not what happened to him. And so that drives me nutty. People will come up and say, oh, you must be thrilled, he's done so good, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, yes, but it's like they don't want to acknowledge the loss. They don't want to keep it. I don't know if they think I don't want to talk about it, but they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to, let me go back. And so what we need, just like everybody, listen to our story and listen patiently and non-judgmentally. And we have a lot to share and a lot to talk about. And so, it isn't like every time we're together, but there are people that I've needed to tell my story and say and process things. I'm very extroverted and external processor. So for me, that was critically important. People would say to us, well, I'm praying for you, God's going to heal you. And my mother and my mother-in-law both just believed that healing was that he was going to go back to being a physician and his mind would be completely restored. And God chose not to do that. And so I actually don't talk to my mother-in-law much because she's still, to this day, well, God's not done, and I really, it's like, I know that, but her interpretation of healing, she's very judgmental because she didn't think that I had enough faith to believe that he would be healed. So that's, you can't put your interpretation on other people's experiences and their disability. Let's see, go back. Do things with us that help rejuvenate us. inviting us to your house for dinner, or going out to dinner, or going, I love to ride bikes and walking. And I've had no one ever offer to, so I can't leave my husband for very long. And so no one offers to do respite care support, because again, the loss is hidden to them, or they don't realize what's going on. And so those kinds of things can be really helpful for people, especially with Alzheimer's. And people know that in Alzheimer's, but we need support. Help us sort through our emotions, help us reconstruct helplessness and move towards hopelessness. And that's just listening. I had a ton of guilt and self-blame, because I knew he was doing that, but I thought he'd finished. And so for a long time, I thought, why wasn't I there? And here I moved it again. Why wasn't I there? And why didn't I, why I could have prevented him from falling off the roof. And it ended up the police thought that I had pushed him off the roof. So I had to go through a lot of stuff with that, which did not help. They thought we'd been fighting and I had gone up there with him and pushed him off, which was interesting. They interviewed all my neighbors. So that made it even worse. But help us find meaning in the loss. And I've had a few people and I'll tell you in a minute how we found more meaning. I love it when people tell stories, and he does too. His short-term memory, a lot of his memory's gone. He doesn't remember anything about medicine. He knows he was a physician, but he doesn't remember, what we think of as in terms of medical knowledge. So when people tell stories about what he meant to them as a physician, people that we've known at church for a long time tell stories about, I remember that time when we painted the kids' rooms, the kids' rooms at church, and just, helping him build meaning and reconstruct his life. And I would say, give us time. We're searching for new hope. So God really spoke to me about finding opportunity in the ruins. And I've been able to share this with a few people, but when my husband was in the ICU in that super coma state and intubated on a respirator and tubes everywhere and not moving, and he swelled up like a water balloon, the pastors, the elders came in and they prayed from James 5. And so about 2 years later, I was studying James again, and I thought, was he healed? And that was hard for me. And the Lord showed me. So what eventually happened, because he was driving me nutty at home, just not having anything to do. And he was very depressed. And so I searched and searched and found out that the Union Rescue Mission needed volunteers. And it was hard getting him in a place where at first they had him greeting people and answering the phone. And that was terrible because he didn't know what to say on the phone. He couldn't talk very well. And then men who come to the mission have mental health issues, and he couldn't and so he didn't do very well in that. And they didn't want him to come. And I thought, but he's strong, so they put him in a physical manual labor job. And now he works in the pantry and he moves boxes and he makes food donations and accepts things. And so he's just like a super manual worker. And the Lord spoke to me about my idea of restoration, and people's ideas. At my church, my mother-in-law was that he would be a physician again and be normal. And the Lord told me that that Richard had always been his servant, that he loved serving him. He was a servant of the Lord. He was a servant as a physician. He was a servant as a husband, as a father. And the Lord told me, he said, he's serving me now at the mission. And I thought the Lord did restore him to be the servant of the Lord. And that was the most important thing to my husband, is being restored. I share these biblical things that God just brought to me, and doing it obviously very briefly, because I think in any disability and any loss, getting into the Word of God and letting God open our minds and reframe it for us. And someone couldn't walk up to me and say, well, he's still serving God, you should be happy. But my own discovery of that through the Word of God was just unbelievable. And recently, our pastor preached on the wedding supper of the Lamb. And we got done with the sermon and we were praying, and I just had my head bowed, and the Lord gave me this vision. You know, you get those in your mind's eye, God speaks to you. And my husband was at the lamb, the supper of the lamb, at this giant banquet feast. And he looked at me in this brief moment in my mind's eye, and he said, I understand everything. I can see it all now. It makes sense to me. And he was so excited, and he was just running around, and he had on a white shirt, long sleeve white shirt. And I just, it's got the idea that we will be restored is like, that's the, in the end, that's the answer for us as believers, even though, so in the meantime, we're trying to discover meaning and temper mastery and restore hope and do all these things and live with this both and world. But that's the promise of the future. And so these are the references I have studied. There's an excellent book by Patrick and Tammy McLeod, Hit Hard. Their son was a middle school football player and suffered a brain injury, but they didn't know it. And then it ended up getting worse. And now he is he's very physically and mentally disabled. And so this happened about 10, 11 years ago, when they wrote this book about their journey. And she talks about, that's how I got introduced to the concept of ambiguous loss, because their son was still here, but he wasn't here for them. And so, yeah. And anything Pauline Boss's book, she has a website on ambiguous loss. It's just called ambiguousloss.com. So yeah, so can I take any questions? Renee commented that people are trying to cover up their own uncomfortableness. And that is so true. Yeah. So they don't, and I think that happens with disability all the time. And I think we could probably interact here if people want to open up. We turn off or turn on your microphones. And so people, yeah, and disability, I think often you don't know what to say. And so you want to make a situation better. We want to fix things. And don't try to fix it. Just listen, active listening, letting us move on. I think disability is an ambiguous loss for many people, so I got introduced to this because of my husband being here, but not here. But I think I think disability is an ambiguous loss. So, yeah. And Renee's recommending prayer in the night. So any comments or other questions?
I think I could comment on your, how you mentioned the idea of guilt, and having a little bit of experience with caregivers in general, dementia caregivers, cancer caregivers. I think this issue of guilt is real, and not just guilt that maybe you could have prevented something, but the guilt in feeling that you wish something was different, and like, or that maybe you think to yourself, like, it would be easier if this person had died or would die already. And that's an awful thing to, you think, oh, that's an awful thing, how could I think that or say that out loud? But it's God doesn't want us to be, he doesn't like the way things are either, and this is not his ultimate plan, for the world. And thinking about his loss and his, how he is waiting on that idea of really full restoration, I think is sort of part of that. It's okay to not be happy that things are not good, and I think people sometimes need that affirmation. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah. And I also think that in the church ought to be helping us figure that out,
Yes.
Church ought to be like, my husband feels terribly stupid and guilty. He said to me a million times, I ruined our lives. And I've so much wanted him to be able to talk to people. And I did get him into counseling. He and I went for counseling, but it's like his mind isn't there enough to keep it. You know what I'm saying? And
yes.
for people in the church to engage deeply with you and help you process that, and for help us get into the word. And like the things that God has shown me, like about letting go and not being in control, about just even in my work leading Nurses Christian Fellowship and not being a perfectionist. And there's so much that God can do through suffering and through loss. And I just was reading in Hebrews this week, Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered. And we think, why would Jesus learn obedience? And in the Amplified translation, it talks about it being a special special active special obedience, that it's like his obedience had to go so deep for him to die on the cross and be our savior and go through all the hell he went through. And if Jesus had to learn, if he had to suffer obedience, what could Jesus do through suffering in my life? And the church needs to help us figure that out, or just walk with us in that journey of opening up. And I have not found that in my church. Thought about going to a different church, but my husband needs to be where he was. We've been there 40 years and he can't go anywhere else. I mean, he needs as much familiarity. I've thought about if we ever move, he's really going to have problems because, like even now he loves to go for long walks. And I always say, you got to have your phone, babe, because he can't use the map. It's not like it would help him, but at least I could find him, And so I think if we moved, then he would really be lost. So, yeah. And there's been a few people that told me to just get over it. It's been 3 years now and I should just get over it. And you're like, so don't shut people down, which is hard. I hope that most churches would do differently. I loved listening to the speakers and hearing how ways churches opened up life for people with disabilities. So maybe that's my quest now. I need to, I've thought about with my church, trying to help us do much better job helping those who have lost and who are suffering, because we don't do a good job.
I think sometimes churches just don't really know how to interact and what it is they can do or provide. And I appreciated our speaker, this Dr. Connor, this morning, his comment that sometimes our first stop needs to be educating the church, a ministry to the church about how to minister to people with disabilities.
Yes.
Because people just don't know. And, so then they say dumb things or do dumb things.
Yeah.
Inadvertently.
Renee, do you have any thoughts? Put you on the spot?
Sure. I mean, I'm thinking similarly too about my mother-in-law has a lot of chronic illnesses. And I feel like the church in general, like we do good at things that are short term, right?
Yeah.
So somebody like has surgery and we like put together a meal plan or whatever it is, but for something that's ongoing, we just don't. And I feel like in general, the church doesn't do a good job of caring for people in that way. It's yeah. And so like even hearing Dr. Miles sharing about like having a prayer list of people that are like shut-ins, and she's like, are they really shut in, or is it just because your church isn't accessible enough for them to get to? So just thinking more about like, what are all the different people that we're not caring for well, because it's not something that can be fixed, or it's something that makes us uncomfortable. It's not something that can be easily explained. And so we just, we don't talk about it. We don't listen well. I think, so much could be better if we just listened well.
Listen and get on people's level. Like we have a lot of people in wheelchairs in my church, and I always try to sit beside them, but I haven't really, I hadn't thought about that, how we just look down and talk to them, as we walk out. Or so that had occurred to me. Christine asked the question, how does ambiguous loss relate with compound grief? Boss in her books, Pauline Boss, and I've experienced this, like, because the losses just kept evolving and surprising me. on multiple levels that compounded my grief terribly. And, you know, I think people with disabilities must experience it. I mean, I think ambiguous loss is a great term for people, you know, trying to understand, like you don't, if you're here but you're not here, you had something, you lost it but you didn't lose it. And you know, just, and so because you cannot resolve it, trying to figure out how to live with the ambiguity, and it compounds your grief terribly. And not having a place, a church, and you know, my mother is a very spiritual woman. She's 90. She has cognitive decline, but she's not demented. And my mother-in-law's in like 93. Godly, wonderful woman. And I would have loved to have prayed with him and talked with him, but it was always about, you know, my mom wanted me to go to San Antonio to hear to this preacher's church that she'd seen healing on TV. And she wanted us to go because she thought he could lay hands on Richard and he would be healed. And you think, well, okay. So it just shuts the door when people either act like he's normal, or they act like, you know, God can fix this, or they act, you know, it's like you need to just be with us where we are at and love us, and it compounds our grief. Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, I just had a couple things. I think COVID itself has brought about kind of setting that line between those who can attend and who cannot attend church. And as the faith community nurse at my church, I'll use the word battle. I battled leadership to follow, you know, the CDC guidelines to a T in order for people to feel safe to go there. You know, and those were our so-called shut-ins, or those who were maybe more vulnerable and just needed more assurance that they, you know, would not be suspect to the virus. And leadership said, well, no, they can watch at home. And I just thought it was so sad.
Yeah.
I thought, why would you not do everything in your power? And, you know, one comment from the associate pastor was, well, we spent a whole bunch of money to do online. What else do we need to do? And I have been on a leave of absence as a faith community nurse for over a year because I would not associate with their decisions. And then you were
a loss for you, an ambiguous loss.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one I've been struggling with for quite a while now. And the other one, when you were talking about people's comments, I've had that with my mom, who has Alzheimer's, and she lives in a memory care unit right now. And so many people have said, well, didn't you ever think of just having her live with you? You know, not understanding, I'm working full time. My husband works full time. Our house is not a safe place for someone who has, you know, as severe cognitive struggles as she does.
Yeah.
And, you know, the interesting thing is we did not have a good relationship prior to her Alzheimer's diagnosis. And I really believe that God is using the Alzheimer's to heal whatever we can in that. You know, forgiveness has been extended, I think, on both sides. And, but yeah, just the comments of, oh, well, maybe, you know, maybe if you do more with her, maybe, you know, why can't you update us more often? And like, I'm exhausted. I don't have time to update people.
Yeah.
Go see her if you want to know how she's doing.
What might be
Instead
more
of going
helpful?
through me.
How are you doing? Or you know, wanting to really know.
Right. And I do have one or two people who ask me, you know, how am I doing? But yeah, just wording makes such a big difference.
Yeah. And I think you kind of nailed it. You hit the nail on the head. We serve a redemptive God. And so he
Mhm.
can bring beauty out of ashes. He can,
Yes, absolutely.
things can rise from the ruins. And I've seen that. My relationship, I had good relationships with my kids, but now we are very, very close.
Mhm.
You know, I've seen, you know, like the Lord just really has spoken to me about the world values, you know, success is what God plans for his people, not what we think of as success. So, okay, my husband, white male, good looking guy, you know, physician, top of the world, and now can't talk very well, you know, disabled. But the Lord has really spoken to me about his service at the Union Rescue Mission with the least of these, versus his service as a physician in office, you know, or a physician, you know, I mean, our income took a dive. I mean, a lot of things changed, but I just thought that's the kingdom of God. It's an upside down world. And God says, I am making meaning out of this traumatic brain injury. I'm making meaning. I'm using him. They needed help. I am using him. I have restored him to do what I wanted him to do. And for me to kind of refigure that in my head and not think of him as, oh, he's lost everything. So, well, I think we're supposed to be on break now.
Mhm. That is correct.
So, yeah. So
We're
the next
coming
plenary,
back together at 2:25 for our plenary session.
thank you so much for, I hope this was helpful to you to think about a new term, ambiguous loss. So
Very helpful. Thank you, Kathy, so much for sharing your experience and just sharing the difficulty that you've gone through, the suffering that you and your family have experienced. It's a difficult thing to do, but I'm of the belief that our church needs to understand this, and they need to understand to sit in the uncomfortable so that they can have compassion towards. If we can't do that in the church, how can we expect to do that in the world?
amen. That's a great closing statement. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.